Hello everyone, in this tutorial I'm going to show you how to paint this dog nose in acrylics. So to start with, I'm doing this on a canvas board. I've taped that to a sheet of MDF so that it doesn't move. I can then position it a little bit higher on my easel because this was a 4x6, so a little bit smaller. So what I do to start off with is I don't like working against the white, so I've just painted it with a raw umber watered down mixture and then put my sketch on my canvas board. To get my sketch on that canvas board, I've used transfer paper. You can either trace that image and use the transfer paper or freehand it on a separate piece of paper and then use that transfer paper to get that outline on your canvas. Now the reason why I say that is certainly my preferred method is because canvases I find don't erase easily, so it's much easier to do your freehand sketch if that's your preference on a separate bit of paper and then use that transfer paper onto your canvas so that you make sure that your sketch lines are nice and tidy, you don't potentially ruin any surface of your canvas, and it keeps everything, as I say, just nice and neat. But because I'm using the white transfer paper, obviously that is also another reason why I went with a darker background. Now you can get the transfer paper in a grey, but the white is certainly my preference, and given that the photo here was quite dark that I was working from, the darker base layer would have been my starting option anyway. So regardless of any nose that I'm painting, any pet portrait, I will always block in the shape of the nostrils first and the general shape of the nose on the two bottom edges. I'll map in the midline because most dog noses do have that darker line in the middle, and then that gives me my reference points for my nose. I can know that my nostrils are then in the right place. Now the reason why I think that is really important is if you get the nostrils in a different position, they're slightly further apart, too close together, maybe you've got one a little bit higher than it should be, that will completely change the shape and the look of that nose. So for me, I want to make sure that I've got all of that in place right from the very beginning. I then know that once I've got my proportions correct, I just then need to fill in the area around the nostrils, working from dark to light. You can see from the finished photo in the corner there of my study that the details here need to get lighter gradually. So I want to build up my highlights and leave my very brightest details till the very end. Now most of the time when I work with acrylics, I do work in this way from dark to light. There are some exceptions, but when I'm working on something like this would certainly be my preference. Once I started off with that grayer base layer, you can see now that I'm starting to tint some of those brown reflections within that nose and add in my subtle highlights on top. Now for this noses, because we want to make sure that we replicate that wet look, they are going to have some of that colour from the environment and the surroundings reflecting up in that nose. There was some stronger greener tints to this, but predominantly more of those warmer browns. So I really wanted to make sure that I captured that. So you can see now that each additional layer that I'm adding, I am making sure that the layer underneath is dry, and all I'm mixing here is just more of a richer burnt sienna magenta colour. Now I speak about it a lot in my tutorials about how the exact colour is not as much of a concern compared to the contrast. For this, I want to make sure that I've got my darks as dark as they need to be and my brights as light as they need to be. The photo in the corner there shows that really well. The highlights on the nose are very obvious because the shadows next to it are also very dark. Now with these highlights here, my main aim with any nose that I am painting is that I really want to make sure I've got the 3D effect where the nostrils are curving across and over onto the front surface of the nose. I really want to make sure that I've got that look within any nose that I draw, because otherwise it will look very flat. We want this to look very three-dimensional. The highlights and the shadows are going to be what's going to make that much more realistic. I therefore need to make sure that I'm curving my brush strokes around in that direction of that highlight to replicate this 3D effect. If I have these details too horizontal or too vertical, it's going to completely change the anatomy of this nose. So really study that reference photo for highlights like this really closely. And all of these details here, I might add a glaze and push some of those details back a little bit, but each additional layer, each brush stroke that I'm creating here, like these tiny little details, are all going to be helping to get that texture of the nose. Because acrylics are such a forgiving medium to work with, if you make a highlight too bright, which isn't often the case, but if you do make a highlight too bright, you can just add a glaze over the top to help to push that back. I like working with Liquitex Basics because they do have that transparency about them. They're really good for glazes. I did use glazes in this towards the last few stages to just push back some of those details, add a little bit more depth to this study. And if you would like to see this study in a real-time version, I've got the 1 hour 40-minute tutorial available on my Patreon channel. I've got a range of tutorials there, from full-length projects, focus tutorials and bonus videos, both in acrylics and pastels. So if that is of interest, I'll link that in the description below. So now once I've started adding some of those details on the bottom edge, I can start to add some of the texture on the main surface of the nose at the top. This is where you notice more of those circular types of details. So what I do here is I start off by adding those lighter highlights, and I'm now working with a nice fine tip round brush to add some of those darker lines in between. Something to bear in mind with pet portraits is you're only going to be able to add a certain amount of detail within that nose depending on the size that you're working on. So if you had an 8x12 acrylic painting, the nose on that is going to be much smaller than what we're working on here. So we're going to have to scale down all of those details because we just won't have the same space to add them. But in those instances, I would be focusing on my lights and my darks. You can still get that nose looking realistic even if you can't add all of the tiny texture details like what we're working on here. That is all in your lighting. As long as you make sure you've got the nostrils as dark as they need to be with those highlights on the outer surface and the top edge of the nose, it is still going to look 3D. And if you've got an overly strong light source in the reference photo you're working from, the nose is one of those areas where it's going to replicate that. Because it does have that damp look about it, that wet look, it's going to be very reflective. So if you do have a light source from one side, be sure to make sure that you do capture that on your study. Now that being said, noses are one of those elements where you can have bounced or reflective light. So you might have a highlight on the opposite side of the nose. It will be more subtle, but you might have a highlight there where it is bouncing off from something else within that reference photo. Those tiny little details make such a difference to the finished painting. So really zoom into that nose when you're working on any pet portrait. Zoom into that nose to make sure you notice all of those subtle differences. Now, acrylics is one of my favourite mediums because if you do a layer that you don't like, you can very easily cover it. There are a couple of options. You can just carry on layering until you get it how you want it to look, or as long as the layer underneath is completely dry and what you've just painted, the layer that you don't like, is still wet, you can get a clean, damp brush, run it across the area where you've made that error, that mistake, and it will completely lift away. But you do have to make sure that the layer underneath is completely dry because obviously it will also then take off that layer as well. So for this Patreon video, I really did just want to mainly focus on the nose itself, but I did want to still draw in some of these details to show how I would add this kind of texture. So at the bottom of the nose on this dog, I think this was probably a Rhodesian Ridgeback. There isn't that much hair right at the base of the nose. It does sort of fade out from the muzzle to the nose, and you have an area in the middle where there's some skin texture. So I wanted to make sure that I captured that in this tutorial and just briefly go over that as well. You can also see from the photo in the corner that there were quite a lot of whiskers and longer hairs on the muzzle area. So I'm going to be sort of explaining there where I was using the liner brushes to help to create more of those finer lines. There are many brushes that you can buy, different shapes, the filberts, rounds, flats and so on. But the one brush that I think is really important to try and experiment with as much as you can to get confident with it is a liner brush. They are what I use for my whiskers, any of my details, my really nice intricate details with longer lines. The liner brush is my go-to brush. You can just use a spare bit of watercolour paper just to practice using those brushes, but it's one of the ones where once you've got that technique, they really are a game changer in how much detail you can achieve in your paintings. But there is a bit of a fine balance to using them. You need to get the mixture just about the right consistency with how much paint and water is mixed on that brush. There is no specific recipe with how much water to use compared to how much paint. It really does come down to the experience. You will start to get a feel for that paint. Now when you're using a liner brush, if you're finding that the paint is not coming off that brush freely, it's a good indication that you don't have enough water in that mixture. If you go the other way and the paint looks like it's starting to look too thin, or maybe you've got a bit of a blob at the beginning of your brush stroke, that's a good indication that you've used too much water and you need to add a little bit more paint. So it really is just a little bit of trial and error. But once you've got the hang of the consistency required, it does become a lot easier. It just does come with practice. So regardless if I'm working on a study or a full project, I will make sure that I get my base layers as accurate to that reference photo as I can. Now the Patreon version does include the liner and the reference photo for any members who do want to paint along, but the one thing that I talk about in every single tutorial is how I like to get my base layers accurate. There are foundations for our details, so if we pay that extra bit of attention here to make sure that we're getting our lights and our darks close to that reference photo, I do believe that it makes it easier for when we come to add our details on top. At the moment I'm doing a little bit of wet on wet blending here, so because my paint mixture is a little bit thicker, less water, I'm able to make sure that I keep this wetter for longer. You also, the more you use acrylics, you just get used to painting that much faster to help with that drying time. But how quick acrylics dry is one of the common complaints that they can have, but there are ways that you can work around it. You can use a fine mist sprayer bottle and lightly put a light layer of water over the top of your painting so that to keep that layer wet for longer. You don't want the water running down your canvas. That will indicate that you've put far too much on the surface. Wait for that to dry and then redo a light layer. That will help to keep that paint and that layer wetter for longer. But there are instances where we want to use the benefits of how quickly the acrylics dry to our advantage. I do find that when I worked in oils, I was a lot slower with getting my pet portraits to my client because obviously the drying time really can hinder things. You don't have that with acrylics. But you do have that advantage of either using the fine mist sprayer bottle or an airbrush, if you've got it, to keep layering a light layer of water over the top to help to keep those layers wetter for longer. So this is one of my favourite liner brushes. It's about 1 inch long. The bristles are really nice and soft, so you can get these nice intricate details. And like with a liner brush, and the same with using a pencil really, how much pressure you put on that brush, you're going to get a longer or a thicker line. So if you're wanting some very short but fine details, you want to be hardly putting any pressure on that brush at all. You don't want there to be much bend in the bristle for those kinds of details. If you're trying to get a longer, thicker line, obviously you'll then have to have that brush in contact with the canvas for that much longer, but also if you're wanting that thicker line, just put a slightly bit more pressure on that brush midway through that brush stroke. When we are painting fur, especially when using the liner brush, you want to try and make sure that you ease into the pressure and you ease off when you lift up that brush stroke. That will help to get these nice tapered lines at the beginning and the end, like what I'm starting to capture here. With my fur detail, I don't like the look where you end up with a harsh start or a harsh stop line. I think that can create some fake looking fur. I don't like that in my paintings, so I've got used to trying easing into that pressure and then, as I say, easing off with that to try and create the details that I am here. Another big tip when using a liner brush like this, you can see that I don't have the paint all the way up to the silver section of this brush. That's really important for something like this because the bristles are that much longer compared to other brushes. If you get that paint wedged up the top there, they will have a tendency to split. These brushes are a bit more fragile than others given how their shape of them and how long these bristles are, so we need to make sure that we are looking after them as best as we can. And now that I've got more of this study in place, you can start to see now how much texture I've got in this dog nose. My overhead lights were making my painting a little bit more overexposed. You can see the sharp contrast in the photo in the corner. But with these little details, these whiskers on the muzzle area here, combined with the texture of the nose, it looks that much more realistic. The details on the muzzle as well are not all travelling in the same direction. That also is very important. I don't want my details to be straight and I don't want them to be overly curly as well. For this, we just want them to have that curve in the middle and that they both start and stop with that nice eased in transition. So with the fur on the muzzle here and the bridge of the nose, I'm still now making sure that I'm starting to shorten my brush strokes here, but I'm using the same liner brush that I was using to create those longer whiskers. The more that you get confident with using your brushes, you will find that you then start to be able to use some of your other brushes for different kinds of fur types, exactly like what I'm working on here. Now for me, most of the time I can't be bothered to keep on washing off the brushes, so I've just found that some of my brushes I can use for multiple options. Now that doesn't mean that that's the right or wrong answer, it does just come down to personal preference. So if you do like to work with more of your individual brushes depending on the specific shapes, then obviously that's fine to do that. But if you are going to use a liner brush for the details like what I'm doing here, you need to make sure that you're starting to shorten your brush strokes to replicate that difference in fur texture. I wouldn't want the brush strokes here on the side of the muzzle and on the bridge of the nose to be as long as those whiskers, because I will then make it look like he's a longer coated dog compared to what, the Rhodesian Ridgeback is got that shorter type of fur coat. So I do want to make sure that I'm indicating at that, even though this is just a study. Also, on the bridge of the nose, even though it is a very small portion that you can see here, you want to make sure that you've got that sloped effect where it looks like the bridge of the nose is starting to join up to the top of and the front surface of the skull. So when we've got a pet portrait and we're drawing the whole face, be sure to make sure that you've got that gradual slope. In some cases it will become more acute if you've got more of a face-on photograph that you're working from, but do be sure to make sure that you'll get that difference in that fur direction. If the fur on the bridge of the nose or the muzzle is too flat or too broad, we're going to completely change the look of that animal's face. So here I'm just applying a glaze. It's thinned down with water, about the consistency of milk. I don't like to use any other mediums with my acrylics. I do just thin my glazes down with water. And as you can see from the glaze, it allows you to still see all of those lovely details underneath. But once that paint has dried, it's now going to just, as you can see, make it look like it's got that burnt sienna look to it. And it's more than achievable to do a painting in black and white and completely add the colour separately just using glazes. That technique can completely eliminate all of the worry and that hesitation we might have when trying to choose the colour right at the very beginning. And it's at this stage what I'll do is I'll take a step back from my easel and I'll have a look and see what I need to alter in my painting. So at the moment I'm starting to work with glazes. I really wanted to hype up that warm brown colour in the nose there. So again, I'm adding some more of those browns, those burnt siennas, to really make sure that I've got that glaze in place. It's still allowing all of that nose texture to show through. And my very last thing that I will then do is add the whiskers. Now the whiskers are the very last thing that I add because they overlap everything else. I want them to then look, give that appearance that they are on the very top. If you end up painting the whiskers in too early, what we'll have to do is then paint around them. That can then create almost like a glow effect around those whiskers where we're not able to paint completely up to that whisker. So it's a really good habit to get into, to leave the whiskers until the very end. And here is the finished study. So I really hope that this video here was of use. If it was, I'd really appreciate it if you could give the video a thumbs up, because it really does help. And if you want to get notified of the future content and the videos that I upload, hit the subscribe and the bell button, and I'll be uploading another video here to YouTube at the weekend.